is that, like, are those companies named in the survey? Is it possible for us to see possibly who those people are and who those companies are, because we know that all social movements are driven by monetary gains, and if we support those companies that don't support us, how are we going to like start up a social movement? Are those the companies named?
Well, there is information available actually about which companies kind of have clear policies of discriminating against people who have been formerly incarcerated. But what's interesting actually is that it's more difficult to find a company that doesn't discriminate against people with criminal records than those that do. Most companies today routinely discriminate against people with criminal records, and most increasingly companies now rely on these private background check companies to screen all the employment applications that come through before any HR person or personnel person even takes a look at them. They're screened by these private background check companies. And often these private background check companies are pulling up information not just about felony convictions, but arrest records and all the rest, which can be used against people in the hiring process as well. I do believe that economic boycotts can be effective, and I believe that can be one strategy. But in calling for an economic boycott of a company that clearly is discriminating against people with criminal records, it's going to require a fair amount of public education about why it's necessary to give people with criminal records employment opportunities. And so I think economic boycotts are a great idea, but in doing so, you've really got to be prepared to do a fair amount of public education work. Otherwise, you're going to be dismissed out of hand as, well, of course, we screen for criminal records, which is the norm today. It's the general rule rather than the exception.
I see that there are 3 other questions up there. Why don't we take the questions and then she'll answer them. So all 3 of you ask your questions and then she'll respond.
My question is that with such kind of continuous social discrimination and stigma associated with convicts and felons, have you noticed in your research any indication that there's a higher rate of mental illness and depression among ex-cons and felons due to this kind of continuous social stress?
Yeah, actually, I haven't seen studies particularly on that. I'm guessing they've probably been done, but it's an interesting question, and I'd like to look into that more. Certainly based on kind of self-reports, what people describe as their experience following release from prison. There's a lot of self-reports of depression and anxiety associated with being unable to find jobs or housing or support oneself, and the whole experience of going to prison is extremely traumatizing. And many people who go to prison without any mental health problems develop them in prison because they find it difficult to cope in their new environment. And so I think it's definitely an area that I'm interested in exploring more.
I was wondering if
I'm
you,
supposed to take all the questions first.
I was wondering if you were familiar with the Concealing of Criminal Records Act that was passed in Illinois. That was passed on a state level, and I think that it's really difficult to get that kind of legislation passed on a state level, and that's why Illinois is the only state. But do you think that that's something that's feasible, that we could organize and try to lobby to get a piece of legislation like that introduced on a city level? Is that even possible to pass?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, this is the thing. In the last chapter of the book, I describe a laundry list of reforms that are necessary and that are achievable. So it's those kinds of, Concealed Records Acts, expungement laws that, would expunge people's criminal records, within a, hopefully very short period of time. Ban the Box campaigns that have been launched by organizations like All of Us or None, groups of formerly incarcerated people who have been organizing for their basic human rights, have been successful in some states. I think it would be really useful to organize for your state to opt out of the federal policy banning food stamps denying food stamps to people convicted of drug offenses. It's possible for states to opt out. I think only 8 have. So there are many issues around which particular groups, organizations can begin to organize and mobilize. And there's tremendous amount of work that has been done successfully in other communities. The important thing, and I think what distinguishes reform work from movement building work, is that if the work is done as though this is an isolated problem, and the policy is talked about that you're seeking to reform in isolation from the larger system of mass incarceration, once you win that isolated policy reform, you really haven't shifted people's understanding or consciousness around the larger system you're trying to challenge. So in organizing to ban the box, you're saying we're trying to end all forms of discrimination against people convicted of a felony, and this is our first priority. But we also want them to have the right to vote. We also want them to be able to serve on juries. We also want them to have housing. We believe folks are entitled to basic human rights, the right to work, the right to housing, the right to food, no matter who you are, what they've done. And this is the particular policy reform we're seeking that's part of our larger agenda. And I think, unfortunately, too much of the policy reform work that has been done in recent years has been treating felon disenfranchisement as an issue that's separate from employment discrimination or separate from housing discrimination, when they are all very much linked and operate kind of collectively to create this caste-like system.
Thank you so much for your analysis and advocacy. The work that you're doing, and Angela Davis and many other intellectuals and scholars, is so important for movement building. We need ideas and we need arguments. I wondered if you could pivot slightly from the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration and consider whether there are any important connections to be made around the school to prison pipeline, what's going on in public education, No Child Left Behind, and the adverse impacts this is having on young people of color, on working class youth in the schools. The sort of dismantling and ultimate privatization, it seems, of much of the public education sector.
Yes, well, there's been a lot of great work that's been done on kind of the school to prison pipeline and how harsh and racially biased school discipline policies in particular are pushing kids out of school onto the street and then ultimately into the prison system, and how our failing system of public education and ghetto communities in particular are helping to feed the growth of the prison system. I don't talk much about our education system in the book for one major reason, which is that I think there's a myth that the reason there's so many black folks in prison is because we have bad schools. And that's not the case. We've had bad schools for a very, very long time, in our communities. We've never had the kind of incarceration rates that we have today. So it's not that bad schools cause mass incarceration. Bad schools ought to be fixed, for sure. But I think that there's a tendency to imagine, oh, well, rather than working on criminal justice reform, we should kind of catch kids before they go in by fixing our schools. When the reason we have an exponential increase in our prison system isn't due to a rapid increase in crime rates. Education, bad schools do contribute to crime and joblessness, but mass incarceration has been driven by, a drastic increase in law enforcement in communities that has relatively little to do with crime. So it's been the result of a war, a roundup mass arrests in poor communities of color. And very often my students will say, well, how could it possibly be that incarceration rates go up even when crime rates are flat or going down? There's this, people have this idea that, well, of course, incarceration and crime rates have got to be linked in some way. And I say, no, actually, incarceration rates are driven by arrest rates. So if you arrest a lot more people, you're going to incarcerate a lot more people, regardless of whether crime is going up or down. And so as long as we have these sweet policies, and these drug task force operations going on in these communities, and stop and frisk programs where officers are rewarded in overtime and cash for as many arrests as they can make, and funding is flowing to these agencies to boost arrest rates, we're going to continue to have lots of good kids who are trying to do well in their schools going to prison, and the system will continue to function well for a long time. So I think we need to make the connection between education and incarceration, because we could have a lot more funding going to our schools if we stop spending billions of dollars on our prison system. But we also have to be careful not to reinforce the dominant myth that the reason we have mass incarceration is because of failing schools.
I want to thank you all for coming tonight. As we said, the books, if you're interested in purchasing the books, they're still selling them outside. And she'll sit around here at this table for about 10, 15 minutes.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.